Chapter 36. The Worth of a Bloodthorne. Marcus stood in front of Valise with one of his arms stretched out. His fur was completely drenched in blood, with bits and pieces of deep dark red trickling down to his elbow before pattering onto the scorching sand. He had pierced her horse's head with fingernails that were strong enough to carve through mountains and was only a few inches short of digging into her eyes. It wasn't that he stopped because he was merciful. The intention to kill her was fully there. He only stopped because he was held back by some sort of strange fabric that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere and tightly wrapped around his arm like a bandage. It baffled him that something as thin as a wedding veil was able to stop a force that practically rivaled the impact of a cannonball. He could hardly believe that someone as young as Valise possessed the auric mastery to conjure up a powerful technique like that so instantaneously. A sudden realization made the hair on the back of his neck stand up like needles in a pincushion. The tattoos on her face had changed shapes again. He didn't know the exact meaning of the inked symbols, but figured that they must have had something to do with her unusual abilities. A strange feeling washed over him and submerged him in an ever-deepening pool of unease. He didn't understand what was happening, but if he had experienced this sensation before, he would have recognized the feeling as fear. True to his name, however, he snarled at her and bared his fangs in defiance. Valise stared back at him with frigid eyes that showed no emotion whatsoever. The hollow smile that could instantly freeze a lake of lava was still etched onto her face like the haunting permanence of a death mask. The headless corpse of her horse slumped to the ground, but she remained unmoved, levitating for a brief moment before graciously landing on the tip of her toes. She calmly walked away from Marcus and gently held the whimpering creature by its mangled hand. The tattoos on her cheeks transformed and shifted to her forehead, forming a column of symbols that dropped down to the bridge of her nose. In an instant, she tore off the creature's arm with a swift and sudden yank, completely painting herself red in a fountain of blood. She whispered something in a language Marcus had never heard before. The amputated arm immediately petrified and crumbled to dust, almost indistinguishable from the sand of the Doran. Within seconds, 5 stone-like vines slithered out of the creature's shoulder and interlaced with each other to form a new limb.
"Who are you, really?"
Marcus asked, doing his utmost best not to let the apprehension seep into his voice.
"Valise,"
she answered dryly. The symbols on her face swirled around and crawled back to her cheeks like 2 streams of black tears. Simultaneously, the strange fabric around Marcus's arm loosened and dispersed into the air like a cloud of spores. The smile on her face remained unchanged, but seemed to cast a hauntingly genuine expression of joy now.
"Everlong."
Marcus widened his eyes in shock, but wasn't given the time to truly let the revelation sink in. The creature was already made whole again, and eager to test out its brand new toy. It immediately leaped into the air, closing the distance between itself and its prey at a frightening pace. The interlaced vines that made up its right arm converged into a sharp point like a 9-feet-long lance. Marcus saw the attack coming from afar and probably could have evaded it with ease if he tried, but after having broken his hand hitting the creature's skull before, his very pride was now at stake. He lowered his stance, kept his eyes focused on the sharpened limb, and just as the creature cocked its arm, he shifted a few steps forward to throw off the timing and coordination of his foe's attack. A straightforward thrust, like the sting of an oversized hornet, skewered his abdomen. The creature almost charged right through him, but only because he let it happen. For now, he was just inches removed from the creature's face and in perfect position to launch an attack of his own. He gathered all his strength into his fist and dug his powerful knuckles into the egg-shaped dome that felt like a steel wall before. Blood instantly poured out of the pulped crater by the gallons as the creature slumped to the ground, instantly removed from showing any signs of life. He looked at his abdomen and scoffed. Taking such heavy damage from the creature's attack was reckless, but as long as his heart was still intact, he could always count on his body to heal itself. The restoration might consume a lot of energy, but he would have wasted even more had he fought the creature in a prolonged battle. At least now he was able to land a clean shot and put a definitive conclusion to their collision. Like snapping a dry branch off a dead tree, he broke off the lance-like limb and tossed it on the sand. The air around him began to distort like the heat from a furnace, and immediately the gaping hole in his stomach sealed shut. He turned to the young girl who was completely drenched in red and made sure to pay careful attention to the symbols on her face. The second they would start to change shape, he was going to rip out her throat.
You said your name is Valise Everlong,
he said quietly. The longer he stared at her, the more it made sense. Her silver hair, cold, blue eyes, high cheekbones, and thin, narrow lips. He had no doubt that she could very well be an Everlong.
Does that mean you are related to Eamon and Aaron Everlong?
Valise kept her eyes firmly fixed on Marcus's abdomen with great fascination.
Never met them.
She answered in a flat voice.
Esau called you princess, so who is the king?
Not king. Emperor.
Emperor?
Marcus corrected himself with a slight nod. He figured it was in his best interest not to upset her too much and to buy himself some more time to regain his strength.
Who is he?
Cain Everlong.
Her answer raised one of his eyebrows and squished his face into a frown. He remembered his father mentioning a childhood friend named Cain one time during a rare bonding moment between father and son. But that Cain never had a family name as far as he knew. And more importantly, that Cain supposedly died a long time ago. It couldn't have been the same person, and yet hearing that name again felt like finding a missing piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he was trying to solve.
And what is the goal of Cain Everlong?
That is not mine to share.
Why are you attacking me?
You are in my way. Also, Elandra wants you for her collection.
The symbols on her face began to swirl into a black smudge and smeared itself across her face from temple to temple. Marcus wasn't in a hurry to find out what other bizarre technique she had in store and launched himself forward. He closed the distance within the blink of an eye, but the translucent veil that stopped his attack earlier manifested out of thin air to stop him once again. It was impossible for him to readjust his trajectory, and like an animal trapped inside the net of a poacher, he got ensnared within the strange fabric. Immediately, he began flailing his arms around like a rabid beast in an attempt to free himself. But no matter how ferociously he tried to claw his way out, the thin, translucent veil never revealed so much as a hint of a tear. Meanwhile, Valise turned away from him and moved toward her lifeless creature in small, elegant steps. She went down on her knees and wrapped her fingers around its slender neck. He couldn't see exactly what she was trying to do, but all of the sudden, heard a few muffled pops and crunches that sent a tingling sensation down his spine. His eyes widened. If Valise somehow had the ability to bring the creature back to life, all the energy he had spent thus far would have been for nothing. He couldn't allow that to happen. He slammed his palms on the sand with a thunderous strike and growled. The fur on his back sprang up and stiffened to sharp, menacing spikes. The air that was trapped inside the veil distorted, angrily twisting everything around him out of shape. His muscles grew and hardened to rough, clustered chunks of iron ore. The fabric started to swell up like a balloon that was filled with hot air. It kept growing until the creases stretched to a tight surface. With a sudden burst, he launched to his feet, spread his arms wide, and exploded in a mighty roar that sent out a shockwave of energy, tearing through the veiled barrier. He immediately fell back down on his knees, but this time, his palms were merely leaning on the sand to keep himself upright. On a good day, which meant pretty much any day of his life outside of the period he spent in the Doran, he would be able to sustain his animalistic form for hours on end at full intensity. But in his current condition, he figured that he might have 15 minutes left in him, tops. And he could only hope that he wouldn't be as technically correct about the estimation as he had been, judging the amount of water he had left in his flask. He raised his head to the blood-soaked girl who stared back at him in surprise.
Seems like you underestimated the might of a Bloodthorne,
he said, and forced a grin on his face. But it quickly turned into a grimace when he saw the creature rising to its feet behind Valise. Not only was the monstrous creature resurrected, it had been brought back to life with several modifications made to its hellish appearance. No longer was its skin pale and chalky like an axolotl. Instead, an exoskeleton covered its entire frame in armor that seemed to be made from some sort of black steel. The oversized, egg-shaped head was stretched out to a curved cone, and the chaotic collection of daggers that resided within were rearranged into neatly organized rows of weaponized teeth. A long, slimy tongue was hanging from its mouth and lazily dangling in front of its protruded ribcage. Thick and stringy saliva dripped down to the ground, corroding the sand with sharp hissing sounds. Marcus's face turned grim in an instant. He could almost see the seconds ticking away from his estimated time limit, and was wondering what Principal Aaron, or even Cato, would do in his situation. Would they still preach patience and timing as the key to victory? Surely they would see the urgency to end the fight quickly. What would his father do? Would the great Mycon Bloodthorne surrender his own safety, fight until the bitter end, and go out in a blaze of glory? He already knew the answer. Of course his father would, and so must he. His famed lineage left him no other choice than to engage. Victory or defeat, it didn't matter. The worth of a Bloodthorne was only measured by the valor shown on the battlefield. The sand around his hands and feet began trembling in fear of the power he was harnessing. Though weakened and fatigued, his eyes showed an edge that went far beyond the sharpness of his fangs and claws. As a fellow predator, the creature immediately recognized Marcus's look as a challenge for dominance. It too assumed the stance of a loaded ballista and waited for the right moment to unleash its fury. Unlike the infantile impatience it showcased earlier, the creature seemed to have gained a sharper mind for tactics with its transformation. It puffed up its chest like a croaking frog, held the straining gesture for a couple of seconds, and ejected a clot of gummy mucus from its mouth like a bolt. Marcus, having noticed the corrosive attribute of the creature's saliva earlier, didn't take any chances and sidestepped the projectile. In a flash, the creature vanished from his sight, leaving behind only a cloud of sand. But even if his eyes couldn't keep track of his opponent, he still had his nose to rely on. He quickly spun on his heel, turned around, and deflected a slash from the creature's viney arm. He shifted forward to negate the disadvantage in reach and leaped into the air for a counterstrike with his knee. The creature was unable to block an attack from this distance in time due to its long and clumsy limbs, but instead nimbly arched its spine backward until it touched the sand with the tip of its cone-shaped dome. Marcus swiftly loaded up for an immediate follow-up strike, but saw a translucent scarf appear from the corner of his eye and was forced to retreat a few steps back. He briefly glanced at Valise, who wasn't paying attention to him, but instead kept her eyes on the distant horizon. This might be his chance for victory. With both the creature and the strange fabric on one side of him, and Valise by herself on the other, she should be completely unprotected. He got down on all fours and launched himself toward the young girl. He could immediately feel the creature hot on his trail, but was forced to ignore its threatening screeches for the time being. He couldn't allow his focus to be divided. This was an all-or-nothing situation for him, and he had to make his attack count. He was still about 20 yards removed from her, but ferociously flung an arm over his shoulder with all fingers spread wide. His claws tore through the air, sending ripples across the desert that twisted the very fabric of reality as they soared toward the blood-soaked girl. Valise turned her head to Marcus, but seemed rather unamused by the rude interruption to her staring at the horizon. The black streak across her face diluted and formed 2 strings of runic symbols that ran down from the inner corners of her eyes. She saw the ripples distorting the air in front of her, but patiently waited until the very last moment before taking action. Without lifting her hand, she made a snap with her fingers that was as loud as a thunderclap. Before Marcus understood what happened, he was on his knees, coughing up a mouthful of blood. Every part of his body hurt. He looked down and stared in shock at the massive gashes across his chest and abdomen. The wounds were immediately sealing shut before he lost too much blood, but the restorative powers came at the cost of his endurance. At this rate, he would return to his human form in a matter of seconds rather than minutes. He raised his eyes that were trembling with rage when he realized that Valise somehow managed to swap places with him. She never looked back, undoubtedly deeming him unworthy of her attention. She stood where he stood less than a second ago, whispering something in a language he didn't understand. and lit up a smile that terrified Marcus to the core.
You and Esau have both mentioned something called Umbora. What does that mean?
He laboriously crawled back to his feet. The wounds may have closed, but he still felt the agony of a strike that could tear down a city wall. His confidence was waning, and he struggled to keep himself upright, but still refused to surrender that easily. All he needed to do was to buy himself some more time to recover. He still had one final trick up his sleeve before time ran out. Valise finally acknowledged his presence and slowly slid her eyes to him.
It is the word for usurper in the old Doran tongue.
Who is this usurper you speak of, and what do you want with him? Esau said that Umbora wasn't ready to be harvested yet. What did he mean by that?
That is none of your concern.
Marcus bit down on his teeth and repositioned himself between Valise and the creature within the blink of an eye. The air around them contorted and warped toward a single point at the center, amassing a tremendous amount of energy. The entire desert seemed to be frozen in time for a split second before a silent explosion sent a huge shockwave outward that pulverized everything in its path, obscuring the Doran in a curtain of sand. The force of his attack punched a crater in the desert that could swallow up the entirety of a castle. Nothing could have survived such power, and even Marcus himself was only able to hold on because of his body's remarkable resilience. He coughed and dry-heaved as the cream-coloured grains rained down to the ground. He couldn't see, hear, or smell Valise and the creature. His senses were completely nullified by the chaos of the sandstorm. After a short moment, he turned his eyes to the sky when he noticed the shadow that was cast on him. Hovering high above the crater, Valise and the creature were wrapped up in a ball that was made from dozens of layers of the strange fabric. The explosion tore one side of the barrier completely to shreds. It would have turned the young girl to dust if the creature hadn't shielded her from the shockwave with its steel-like exoskeleton. Marcus could only respond to the sight with a chuckle out of sheer disbelief. He fell to his hands and knees and lowered his head. He felt his bloodlust dwindling as his razor-sharp teeth retracted and sheathed into his jaws. His mighty Gorovi claws dulled back into regular human hands. The shiny anthracite coat unceremoniously shed from his skin like needles of a dead conifer. His rock-like muscles shrunk back to the size of a malnourished man who had spent a fortnight in the unforgiving conditions of a desert nicknamed the Sand Coffin. He saw a pair of dainty, blood-soaked feet landing on the sand in front of his hands, followed by a much less gracious landing of two reptilian feet covered in an armor of black steel. A puddle of blood formed in the sand that was almost immediately absorbed into the grains. He raised his head in defiance and bared his fangs with a proud grin. Even after tearing through numerous layers of the near-indestructible fabric, his explosive attack still had the bite to inflict damage on his foes. Having protected Valise from harm, the creature was rendered heavily maimed, missing an entire arm and nearly half of its torso. If Marcus gathered all the strength he had left, he might have been able to deliver a final blow to end the creature's life. But that was a thought that never even occurred to him. His vision was already swaying, and all he could hear was a high-pitched ringing in his ears. His mind drifted a million miles away, and for a moment, he even thought to catch a whiff of his loved ones. He closed his eyes and awaited his judgment. He was defeated and accepted the morbid consequences with the grace that was to be expected from a Bloodthorne. The creature took a step forward and loomed over Marcus, partially eclipsing the sun with its cone-shaped head. It made a small bow, showing him respect from one predator to another. It then unhinged its jaw with bone-popping sounds and widened its mouth filled with blackened, jagged teeth.